The Tonight Show, NBC Studios, Burbank, March 1973. Johnny Carson had been hosting for 11 years, and he had developed a specific instinct for when a booking was going to be routine television and when it was going to be something that people talked about for years afterward. Tonight's first guest had given him a small private concern from the moment the booking was confirmed, not because she was difficult in any professional sense. She was actually quite polished in the pre-show conversation, but because she had a quality that certain guests carried, the quality of someone who was completely certain about everything they believed and had not recently encountered a reason to update any of it. Her name was Sandra Rhodes, 29 years old, and she was the reigning women's professional wrestling champion of America, a title she had held for 2 consecutive years and defended 8 times. She was 5'10", 185 pounds, built with the specific kind of muscle that professional wrestling at a serious level produces in a person's body, functional and dense and organized entirely around the demands of her sport. Her training background included a legitimate amateur wrestling coach who had competed at the Olympic level, and she was not someone whose physical capabilities were performance rather than substance. She could move people who didn't want to be moved. That was not a trick of the camera or the staging. It was simply what she had built across a decade of serious work. She came out to warm applause and settled onto the couch with the ease of someone who had done television before and understood the format. The opening segment was good. She talked about her career intelligently, about what professional wrestling actually required athletically, about the way the public misunderstood the distinction between the predetermined outcomes and the genuine physical labor involved in producing the show, night after night, over a long career. Johnny asked good questions and she gave good answers, and the audience was engaged. Then Johnny said he had arranged a second guest for the evening, someone whose thoughts on physical performance and genuine skill would make for an interesting contrast with what they had been discussing, and would Sandra welcome Bruce Lee. The curtain opened. The audience response was the response it always produced in rooms where it arrived unexpectedly, a building wave of recognition moving from the people nearest the entrance outward through the sections until the whole studio was expressing it simultaneously. It was the sound of people who are genuinely pleased, rather than people who are performing being pleased, which is a different sound, and which Johnny Carson had been listening to long enough to tell apart without effort. Sandra watched Bruce cross the stage toward the couch. Her expression registered genuine surprise first, because nobody had told her, and then settled into something more considered as he extended his hand, and she shook it, and he took the second guest chair. Johnny said, "I thought it would be genuinely interesting to bring these 2 very different approaches to physical performance into the same conversation. Sandra, you've just been talking about the relationship between what an audience sees and what actually exists underneath it athletically. Bruce, you've spent your career navigating a similar question from a different direction. Are there things you recognize in each other's situation?" Bruce said he thought so. He said that what he had heard Sandra describe, the gap between what the public assumed professional wrestling was and what it actually required physically, mapped onto something he recognized from his own work. That the performance layer and the genuine capability underneath it were not opposites, that the performance was built on top of the capability rather than instead of it. Sandra said, "I'd push back slightly on the comparison." Johnny leaned forward fractionally, the movement of someone who senses something developing. Sandra said, "What I do requires me to manage real bodies in real time with real consequences. When someone falls in my ring, they hit the mat with their actual weight at actual speed, and the impact is real, regardless of the context around it. There is no version of my work where the physics gets softened." Bruce said, "I understand the distinction you're drawing." Sandra said, "I'm not trying to diminish what you do. I've seen your films. The movement is impressive. What I'm saying is that impressive movement in a controlled filming environment and movement that functions against a genuinely resistant opponent are 2 different demonstrations." Bruce said, "They are. The question is, which category my techniques belong to." Sandra said, "In my experience, martial arts demonstrations tend to function best when there's a certain degree of mutual agreement between the participants. The attacks come in on lines that suit the defense. The timing accommodates the technique. Against someone like me, who is not going to cooperate with any of that, I think the picture looks different." She looked at him directly. She said it plainly and without particular hostility, the statement of someone making a technical observation they believe is accurate. She said, "Honestly, I don't think you'd survive my first move." The studio went quiet. Johnny put his coffee cup down on his desk with the careful precision of a man who needs his hands free. "Stop. Subscribe right now. The next 60 seconds of this story is the reason this video has the title it has, and you do not want to miss it because you forgot to subscribe," Johnny said, with the smooth authority of someone who has been managing live television for 11 years and knows exactly what voice to use in exactly this moment. "We are going to take a very brief break, and when we come back, I want to continue this conversation, which is getting genuinely fascinating." The floor director called commercial. The broadcast stopped. The studio did not stop. Johnny stood up from behind his desk and crossed to the guest area with the directness of someone who has decided that distance is not what this moment requires. He said to Sandra, not unkindly, but unambiguously, "I need you to bring this down when we come back." Sandra said, "I said something I believe." Johnny said, "You told him he wouldn't survive your first move, on live television, with however many million people watching." Sandra said, "It was a technical assessment." Johnny said, "I understand that's how you meant it. It didn't land as a technical assessment." He paused. "I want to continue this conversation. It's genuinely interesting, but I need it to be a conversation." He looked at Bruce. "Are you all right?" Bruce said, "I'm fine." Johnny said, "You don't have to engage with the direction this is going. Nobody would hold that against you." Bruce said, "I know." Something in the way Bruce said "I know" communicated that the question, while asked with genuine consideration, was not particularly relevant to what he was thinking about. He was sitting in his chair with his hands resting on his knees, and the quality of attention he was giving the situation was the same complete quality he gave everything. He had not been disturbed by what Sandra said. He had heard it, processed it, and was waiting to see what came next, with the patience of someone who understands that patience is a form of readiness. The floor director called 30 seconds back. Johnny returned to his desk. He picked up his notes. He had a redirect prepared, a question about Bruce's philosophy that would give the conversation a different shape. The cameras came back live. Johnny opened with the redirect. He asked Bruce about Jeet Kune Do, about what the name meant and what the approach was trying to accomplish. Bruce gave a thoughtful answer about intercepting force rather than meeting it, about removing everything from a fighting approach that required specific conditions to work and keeping only what remained valid across different situations. Sandra listened. When he finished, she said, "Can I follow up on that?" Johnny said, "Of course." She said, "You said removing what requires specific conditions, but every martial arts technique I've seen requires some degree of cooperation from the opponent. The opponent needs to be attacking in a certain way, at a certain angle, with a certain commitment. Professional wrestling works with real force, with someone who is genuinely trying to move you or take you down. Does what you're describing work against that?" Bruce said, "Yes." She said, "How do I know that?" Bruce said, "You could find out." The studio made the particular sound of a large group of people who have just understood that something is about to happen. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Show me something. Stand up and let me show you what I mean about real force, and we'll see what happens." Bruce stood. Johnny said, "All right, I want to be clear that this is a demonstration. We're keeping this." Sandra was already up. She crossed the small space between the couch and the guest chair area and stopped a few feet from Bruce and said, "I'm going to show you a basic entry. Nothing dangerous. I want you to respond however you think is appropriate." Bruce nodded. Sandra moved. She came forward with a collar tie, the standard wrestling entry for establishing head control, moving with the genuine speed of someone who has drilled this motion so many times it no longer requires conscious thought. It was fast. It was committed. It carried the intention of her full body weight behind it, her hands closed on empty air. Bruce was not where her hands arrived. He had moved, not backward, sideways and marginally forward, the less intuitive direction, and her hands were reaching past where he had been. Her forward commitment carried her weight beyond her intended point of control, and she was adjusting before she fully registered that the adjustment was necessary. Bruce's right hand touched her forearm as it passed, a brief, light contact that added almost nothing to the direction her momentum was already traveling. Almost nothing was enough. She stumbled forward, not fell, caught herself on her forward foot and converted the stumble into a controlled step. But it had been a stumble, clearly, visibly, in front of everyone. She straightened and turned. Her expression had changed. The professional assessment she had been wearing since the conversation began had been replaced by something more direct, more present, the specific expression of a serious athlete who has just received real physical information and is processing it without any performance around the processing. She said, again. She came at him from a different angle, adjusting for what the first attempt had shown her, trying to get her weight committed earlier and lower to reduce the window he had used. Bruce moved inside this time. He stepped toward her rather than away, taking himself out of the space where her angle was aimed and into the space beside her, and from inside her reach his left forearm met her extended arm with a redirection that was so small in its physical expression that the people watching from more than 10 feet away couldn't see the mechanism, only the consequence, which was Sandra moving in a direction she had not chosen. She caught herself on the arm of the couch. She straightened. Her breathing had changed slightly, not from exertion, but from the focused intensity of someone who is working at full attention. She looked at Bruce. She said, "One more." Johnny said, "I think we should." She was already moving. This time with full commitment, everything she had, the entry she used when she meant to finish something, driving forward with her body weight fully engaged, trying to get inside his space before whatever he was doing could happen again. Bruce accepted her momentum rather than opposing it. He moved sideways with it, letting her forward drive travel in the direction it was going, and as she went past him, his hand found the back of her shoulder and guided what was already in motion in a direction slightly downward from where it had been going. Sandra's knees hit the studio carpet. Both knees. The controlled drop of someone who is trained enough falls to manage a sudden loss of balance without injuring herself, but the knees hitting the floor was unmistakable. 300 people in that studio saw it happen. The studio was completely silent for approximately 2 seconds. Then the floor director made a sharp motion at the camera operators. The broadcast cut. In the studio, where the cameras had stopped and the broadcast had cut, but nothing else had paused, several things happened simultaneously. The security staff that NBC maintained at the wings of the stage were moving. Johnny was up from behind his desk. The producer who had been watching the monitor in the booth had come through the side door onto the studio floor. Sandra was on her feet. She had come up fast, the way trained athletes come up from falls, and she was looking at Bruce with an expression that contained several things competing for dominance, all of them real, none of them clearly in charge yet. She moved toward him. The security staff converged. 2 of them were between her and Bruce before she had covered half the distance, and she was not trying to go through them exactly, but she was also not stopping the way someone stops when they have decided to stop. She was moving with the momentum of someone who has something unfinished and whose body is expressing the unfinished quality of it. Johnny said, "Sandra." She stopped. Not because of her name, because something in the way he said it had the specific weight of someone asking rather than instructing, and the asking landed differently than an instruction would have. She stood in the middle of the space with the security staff around her and looked at Bruce, who was standing exactly where he had been standing before any of it started, watching her with the patient, complete attention he had given everything all evening. She said, loudly enough to carry across the studio, "I want to know what you did." Bruce said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it. Start from the beginning." One of the security staff said something to her quietly. She acknowledged him without looking at him, the acknowledgement of someone who has registered that you spoke, without adjusting what they are doing in response. Bruce said, "Your right shoulder loads before any entry you make, half a second, approximately. It happens before your weight commits, before your hands move. It tells me the entry is coming and gives me information about its direction before you've fully decided to go." Sandra said, "You saw that in the time we've been talking." Bruce said, "I saw it in the first 30 seconds after you sat down." She absorbed this. Her right shoulder moved slightly, and involuntarily, the unconscious movement of someone testing a description of their own body against their internal experience of that body. She said, "I've been training for 12 years. Bruce said, "The tell is built that deep. That's why nobody told you. Most people watching you are working on a different level." She said, "What level are you working on?" He said, "The level before the technique. What the body does before it commits to what it's about to do." She was quiet for a moment. The studio around them was very quiet. The security staff had stopped trying to manage her and were simply present, reading the situation the same way everyone else was reading it, which was as something that had moved past requiring physical management. She said, "Is that teachable?" He said, "Yes," slowly. She said, "I want to learn it." He said, "I know." She looked at him. "You know?" He said, "People who've built what you've built generally want to build more of it when they find out more exists. It's a consistent quality." She was quiet again. Something in her expression had been sorting itself out across the last several minutes and had now arrived somewhere. It wasn't the expression she had walked onto the stage with, and it wasn't the volatile thing from a few minutes ago. It was something simpler and more honest than either. She said, "I said you wouldn't survive my first move." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was wrong." He said, "You were working with incomplete information." She said, "I could have gotten better information before making the claim." He said, "Yes." She said, "I made the claim on live television." He said, "Yes." She said, "In front of a lot of people." He said, "Several million, approximately." Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile if everything around it had been slightly different. She said, "That's not a small number of people to be wrong in front of." He said, "No, but being wrong in front of people and then saying so in front of the same people is one of the harder things a person can do. It's also one of the more useful ones." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward Johnny, who was standing near his desk, watching all of this with the expression of a man who has been hosting this show for 11 years and is watching something he has never seen before and will probably never see again. She said, "Can we go back on?" Johnny said, "Yes." The floor director looked at the camera operators. He looked at the broadcast clock. He looked at Johnny, who gave a small nod. The cameras came back live. If you're still with this story, subscribe before we get to the end. The next part is the part that answers the question the title was really asking. When the broadcast resumed, Johnny said, with the particular quality of lightness that he deployed when a room needed to breathe, "We've had an eventful commercial break." The audience, which had witnessed the unbroadcast version of that break, produced a sound that was part laughter and part something more complicated. Johnny said, "Sandra, I want to give you the floor." Sandra sat forward on the couch. She looked at the camera directly. She said, "I said something on this show tonight that I said without enough information to back it up. I told Bruce Lee he wouldn't survive my first move." She paused. "That was wrong. What he does is real in a way I didn't understand before tonight. I've trained for 12 years and I believe in what I've built. Part of that should have been extending the same respect to what he's built before I dismissed it publicly." She looked at Bruce. "I'm sorry for what I said." Bruce said, "You asked a genuine question in a direct way. The method was abrupt, but the question was real. What's real in a physical confrontation? What actually works? Those are worth asking." She said, "I could have asked instead of declared." He said, "Yes, but declarations sometimes produce answers that questions don't." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that a generous interpretation or an accurate one?" He said, "Both." The audience responded to this, and the response was the warm response of people who have been through something together and have come out the other side with something better than they expected. Johnny said, "Bruce, what do you want to say about tonight?" Bruce said, "Sandra has spent 12 years building something genuine. What happened tonight was two different disciplines finding out something true about each other. That's what this kind of exchange is supposed to produce. The finding out matters more than the discomfort of getting there." Sandra said, "The shoulder tell. You said half a second." He said, "Approximately." She said, "Can it be fixed?" He said, "Reduced. With months of specific work aimed at the weight transfer that precedes it. Your entries will feel wrong during the correction." She said, "How long will they feel wrong?" He said, "Until they feel right again, which is different for different people and different for different patterns, depending on how deeply they're established." She said, "Tell me more about the weight transfer." He said, "After the show." She said, "I'm holding you to that." He said, "I know." Backstage, in the corridor outside the main studio, Sandra found him 15 minutes after the taping ended. She was carrying her jacket over one arm, and she came straight to the point, which was consistent with everything else about how she operated. She said, "The weight transfer, walk me through it." He walked her through it. Standing in the NBC corridor under fluorescent lights, he explained where in the sequence of her entry the tell actually originated, which was not in the shoulder she had been told about, but in the weight shift that preceded the shoulder, the moment when her body committed to a direction before her conscious intention had fully articulated the direction to itself. He showed her what it looked like from the outside, and explained what it communicated about where she was going, and how much time it gave someone who was reading it. She worked through it slowly, feeling the sequence from the inside, identifying the place where the commitment happened before she wanted it to happen. She said, "That's deep." He said, "Yes." She said, "Changing something that deep means rebuilding it from that level, not from the surface." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've rebuilt technique before." He said, "I know. I saw how you train in the few minutes we exchanged. The adjustment speed is real. The depth of your base is real." She said, "That's not nothing coming from you." He said, "It's not intended as nothing. It's accurate." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tonight was uncomfortable." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad it happened." He said, "I think you will be. It takes a while sometimes." She said, "Being wrong in front of several million people." He said, "And then saying so. The second part is the hard part." She said, "The second part is the only part that matters." He looked at her. "Yes." He said, "That's exactly right." She said, "I want to work on the weight transfer seriously. If you're willing to consult on it at some point." He said, "If you're asking because you want to understand something, yes." She said, "I'm asking because what you showed me tonight is the most useful technical information anyone has given me in 12 years, and I don't want to leave it as a single evening." He said, "Then yes." She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was what you expected from someone who had spent 12 years in her discipline and had been conditioning her hands throughout. She felt his grip and registered something in it, the density of a different kind of conditioning, and she filed it with the other things she was filing from the evening. She said, "The shoulder tell. Before tonight, nobody told me. He said, most people are watching at the wrong level. She said, what's the right level? He said, the level before the thing you're watching. She thought about this, walking back toward the parking structure. She thought about it on the drive back to her hotel. She thought about it the next morning when she was in the gym at 6 and began, for the first time, to pay specific attention to the weight transfer that preceded her shoulder loading in her standard entry. She felt it immediately. She had thrown that entry thousands of times. The commitment happened exactly where he had described it. Before she was fully conscious of having decided to commit, she began working on it. Slowly, patiently, building the awareness at that level before trying to change anything. Because you cannot change something you cannot yet feel. The NBC footage from that evening aired in edited form. The conversation aired. The demonstration and what followed did not air, which was the decision of people responsible for a broadcast, who made the call that certain things were better handled as a concluded event than as ongoing television. The 400 people in the studio audience that night were not under any such constraint, and the story moved through the communities that cared about it with the speed and consistency that real things move when they happened in front of enough witnesses. The accounts were consistent where they needed to be consistent. Sandra said he wouldn't survive her first move. Her first move did not produce the result the statement implied. She said publicly that she had been wrong. She asked how to fix what had been shown to be fixable. Those 4 facts, in that order, were what people remembered. Sandra Rhodes defended her championship 4 more times in the 18 months after that evening. People who watched her work during that period, people who had also watched her work before, noted something that they described in different terms, but that pointed at the same thing. Her entries were harder to read. The tell that serious observers had learned to anticipate was reduced to something smaller and less reliable. She was winning the same matches she had always won, but winning them against opponents who found themselves with slightly less advanced information than they expected. She didn't tell them why. She had done the work. The work happened in early mornings in gyms when nobody was watching, feeling the weight transfer and trying to move it later in the sequence, failing and trying again, failing differently and trying differently, arriving slowly and imperfectly at something smaller. Smaller was the goal. Smaller was what she got. Smaller was enough. She retired from active competition 3 years later, having defended her championship 11 times total. She moved into coaching and remained in it for decades, building a reputation among the people who trained under her for a specific quality of patience around technique correction that understood what genuine correction actually costs in time and discomfort, and the willingness to feel wrong for a while. When students struggled with corrections to deeply established patterns, she told them the time was the work. She told them that if it were quick, it wouldn't be deep, and the depth was where the value lived, because the deep things were the ones that stayed when everything else was under pressure. She said this in different words to different students at different times, but the core of it was always the same thing. And the students who trained with her long enough eventually understood that the patience she brought to their corrections was not general patience, it was specific patience that came from somewhere, from a period in her own development when she had been shown something she didn't know about herself and had done the slow work of addressing it rather than the fast work of ignoring it. She never said publicly where the lesson came from. The students who asked got an answer about experience, which was true and complete, and which contained everything it needed to contain. Some things are private, not because they're shameful, but because they're too real for general circulation. Because taking them public reduces them in some way that keeping them private doesn't. Because the lesson belongs to the person who received it and whoever gave it, and broadcasting it changes what it is. Sandra kept the lesson. She did what you do with lessons that contain real information, which is incorporate them into how you move through the world and pass the incorporated version on to the people you teach, not as a story about where it came from, but as the thing itself, direct and applicable and alive in the same way it was alive when she received it. The weight transfer is smaller, after years, still there, somewhere in the foundation of things, but smaller and therefore less of a liability, and therefore no longer the thing it was on the night someone standing in a Tonight Show studio told her exactly where to find it and what to do about it. She found it. She did something about it. That's the whole story. Several million people saw the beginning of it. The end happened in early morning gyms over 18 months, with nobody watching. The end is the part that mattered.